Let's talk about real life warp drives. One little thing before we get started. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and leave me a comment down below. Thanks very much. When we hear the word warp drive, we immediately think about Star Trek and the methods of FTL travel they use to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations, and boldly go where no man has gone before. However, maximum speed of information transfer in the universe is the speed of light, and nothing can travel faster than it. This, however, is only true when we talk about transferring information through space time itself. We know from the observation of the Hubble expansion that parts of our observable universe are moving away from us with an acceleration and are by now moving faster away from us than with the speed of light. This means that space in relation to space is not subject to the cosmic speed limit, which is the speed of light. In 1994, a Mexican physicist with the name Miguel Alcubierre sat down with a piece of paper and a pen and, inspired by watching Star Trek, wrote down a physical model for an actual real life warp drive based on Einstein's theory of general relativity. Known as the Alcubierre drive, this model depicts a gravity well in front of a ship and a gravity, bump behind the ship, achieved by putting a positive mass in front and a negative mass behind the ship. You will correctly note that something like matter with a negative mass does not exist in our known universe as far as we are aware of, and the problem with making such a warp drive is not made easier by the fact that the mass requirements for such a warp bubble to be feasible to carry a ship inside would require the mass of, let's say, Jupiter in front of the ship and the negative mass equivalent of Jupiter behind the ship. This is also the case why this theory has been labeled unfeasible for multiple decades. This changed, however, when in 2011 Harold G. Sonny White from NASA Eagle Space Laboratory published his paper called Warp Field Mechanics 101, in which he outlined a more energy efficient and more feasible redesign of Miguel Alcubierre's original draft. The key, Sonny White points out in his paper, to decrease the energy requirements of an actual warp bubble is to modulate it, which rings some bell for every Trekkie when you hear warp field modulation. And this seems to be another beautiful prediction by Gene Roddenberry, because, changing the geometry in a smart way also changes the energy efficiency of a warp drive. Thanks to, let's just call it what it is, warp field modulation, we can reduce the energy requirement of our warp bubble from the mass of Jupiter down to the rest mass energy of a middle scale truck in front of the spaceship and its negative mass equivalent behind the spaceship. You will, however, again correctly note that it is still unfeasible to build a warp drive, considering that there is also no trucks with negative mass in the known universe. I'm not a person who's easily dissuaded, however, especially because I grew up with Star Trek and was influenced by this utopic, positive vision for the future. I just can't accept that there is no hope, that I would never go out there, see the aliens, and make friendly contact with them, have a positive exchange, and build a long lasting friendship. Okay, I admit it. I just want to go out there and date an Orion slave girl, but whatever. Let's get back to the topic. Because I'm also into ufology, it's unavoidable that I came across the story of that guy called Bob Lazar, who claims that he has been working in Area 51 and was hired by the US government to reverse engineer UFOs. What at first sounds like the story from a madman walking around naked with a sign saying the end is nigh, on a second glance actually starts to look really convincing when you look at what he reports he would have seen when it comes to the inner workings and constructions of said UFOs.
There are three amplifiers. The craft can operate on a single one, can lift off the ground. The way in which it's propelled are two different ways. There's what they call Omicron configuration, where the craft is using one generator, or Delta configuration, where it's utilizing all three. Delta configuration would be for space travel. Essentially, the craft will tilt up on its side.
While his explanation he gives in this interview why this spacecraft is supposed to work and do what it's doing is mostly, as far as I can tell, absolute bullcrap, because there is no mechanism in which magnetism directly repulses from electrons. You always need some, in order to repel or attract a charge, you need the correct opposite charge or the same charge in this case of gravity. He gives us some ideas on how we could get to a negative mass potential without actually having to have negative matter. Me as an electrical engineer, as soon as I did hear the words gravitational waveguide and cyclotron, immediately the concept of microwaves came to mind. Here is some graphics I found on the interwebs which kind of draws the very simplified structure as claimed by Bob Lazar. You can see that we have three cyclotrons and powered by a Moscovium reactor. I suppose what they're actually doing in this spacecraft is producing gravitational waves and polarizing the hull of the ship. Sounds crazy and technobubble, but bear with me because I'm not inventing stuff here. We know that gravitational waves are a thing. LIGO measured the gravitational waves hitting Earth caused by two spinning black holes which were spinning around each other and then merging. During this merge, a gravitational wave occurred and was making its way all to Earth. This was measured by this giant laser interferometer. We also know that there is an effect from moving masses similar to the electromagnetic field produced by a moving charge, due to the fact that, for instance, the Voyager 2 probe had to course correct 2 times due to the, and I say it straight, little spoiler, Gravito-Lorentz force from the spinning sun. So that's all the conditions we need for the gravito-electromagnetism to work, right? So that means we can just formulate gravito-electromagnetism Maxwell equations in the same way we have those equations for electromagnetism. It can be shown that you do not necessarily need matter with negative mass in order to achieve a negative energy potential by looking at quantum foam. Quantum foam, known as vacuum fluctuation, is the spontaneous occurrence and annihilation of particles in a vacuum. In the absence of anything, in empty space, you have continuously protons and electrons and positrons and other particles appearing and disappearing. Particle, antiparticle, appearing, disappearing. It's a zero-sum game of the universe. You have continuously particles appearing, but in the sum there is no particles. Now, if you put the information of, let's say, a positive charge, you put a proton in the vacuum, then this proton disappears, somewhere else a proton appears. It's still the zero-sum game. You have the proton disappears there, a proton appears there. It's 0 plus 1 proton. It doesn't matter. This proton disappears, but somewhere else is still a proton more than no protons. So on average, you have one proton, one positive charge. But it doesn't matter where, right? And that, due to uncertainty principle, that's anyway irrelevant. But this proton has a mass. So now you have the same zero-sum game with the mass. You just have the information that somewhere in this empty space you have an additional piece of mass above zero. So mass and charge, same, are just information about the state of space, of a certain area of space. It does not really account for a specific mass charge or electric charge carrier. It could be speculated that a similar law, which allows for the fermionic field, something like the Fermi-Dirac statistics, also applies to the Higgs field, but has never been scientifically observed in a laboratory because no one has set up the proper experimental setup, and it would be worth investigating if those spaceships really are based on the law of gravitomagnetism, or the GEM equations, then it would make sense that the shell of the spaceship is made from some sort of gravitoconductive material, which means that it's basically serving as a waveguide which gets polarized by a standing wave inside the spacecraft. It would also make sense that those cyclotrons are built around some material which has ferrogravitomagnetic properties, which means that it densifies the gravitomagnetic field lines generated by the cyclotron, or in other words, increases the strength of the gravitational waves generated by that cyclotron. There are many people out there who claim that they would have found and collected fragments from supposed crashed spacecraft of extraterrestrial origins, and it would be very interesting to analyze the behavior of said fragments with some simple experimental setup I'll now quickly explain. What you could do is construct a simple cyclotron, so little particle accelerator, mini CERN, coils, and then you accelerate some protons from a proton tube in a circle, and in the middle of the circle you put the probe. If this sample from the spacecraft has ferrogravitomagnetic properties, then a simple force measurement device, it has to be sensitive in the direction of the frame dragging effect. So the particles in the cyclotron are accelerated counterclockwise in this drawing. Do whatever you want, you can also accelerate it clockwise, doesn't matter. And then you measure the force exerted on a test mass. If that object has ferromagnetic properties, then it will, like a ferrite core in a coil, increase the field strength, so to say. And you will measure an increase in the force of the test object. Likewise, in order to identify the shell, because that comes later after you identified the core material for the cyclotron, you can put samples here and measure whether they're being affected by the gravitomagnetic Lorentz force or not. If they're not, they're suitable shielding material, so the hull material of the spacecraft. But yeah, just a little bit theory, who knows. But yeah, it's untested, not verified theoretical physics, right? So there's no saying whether any of the things I just said were correct. But from the perspective of polarizing waveguides just in a gravitational sense, so generating positive and negative virtual mass using gravitational waves with the right material, if those mechanisms would exist, that would pretty much explain those omega and delta modes Bob Lazar described in his interview. Because for warp travel, you would need a static warp bubble, so one cyclotron and then two other cyclotrons, or at least one, to modulate the bubble and create those special geometries as described in Harold White's paper, right? However, as I said, it's not proven science. There's no scientific research done in this area, mostly because we have no ideas what materials, if any, would even have this behavior, right? So, if any ufologists with samples they think are of extraterrestrial origins are interested to join me and experiment around with those samples in the way I just suggested, then hit me up on Twitter or Fediverse and we can figure something out. It would be interesting. I mean, if we figure out all the materials needed to build a spacecraft, we could build one ourselves, go up there and see the aliens, right? So I'd be up for that. But anyway, what do you guys think? Is there any physicist watching this video who wants to write into the comments down below everything wrong about my video, so that I have at least some interaction, or maybe at least give me a thumbs down if you don't want to give me one up. If you liked what I had to say, please don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye.